Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. And welcome to the show, another adventure into the bizarre world that we live in. I'm your host, Chris James. Bill sent me a note saying I should do a show on both my firefighting misadventures and some more Border Patrol mishaps. He especially wanted to hear the dispatcher problem. Before joining the Border Patrol, I was a firefighter, both paid and volunteer. Being a volunteer was fun and rewarding. Paid, it was too much of a job. A friend of mine said I should join the fire department because girls just loved firemen. I was single, and this sounded like an idea. I had a beard and long hair at the time. I wasn't a hippie or anything, I just never bothered to get a haircut. In construction, nobody really cared what you looked like. I joined the Seabrook Volunteer Fire Department. They needed people, and I had a pulse. The department consisted of one building with 4 vehicles, and maybe 30 people, half of whom were hardly ever there. People had jobs, and sometimes they had to go out of town. The building had been put up in 1932. It was designed for those old fire trucks. As the vehicles got bigger, it seemed like the doors got narrower. Eventually, there was about 3 inches on either side of the fire engine, and the molding on both sides was beat all to heck by people trying to back in through that tiny little opening. Fighting fires, you sometimes wear an air pack, an SCBA, a self-contained breathing apparatus. The mask needed to be against bare skin, so I shaved off my beard. Once I cut off my beard, I figured, well, I might as well get a haircut too. I soon discovered there was way too much politicking going on. Factions would form and people would become disillusioned with those on the wrong side. We didn't have any women, only men, mostly because women never wanted to join. There was a women's auxiliary, and they did a lot of things to help out, but these were the wives of the firefighters. When Seabrook was incorporated in 1961, the Women's Auxiliary loaned the money to the city so they could file the paperwork. The fire department was actually older than the city. When it was first formed, the charter said that the volunteers owned all the equipment in the station. The building was owned by the school district. We had contracts to provide fire protection and rescue to the cities of Seabrook, El Lago, Taylor Lake Village, and parts of Harris County. We also had mutual aid agreements with Shore Acres to our north, NASA Bay and Webster to our west, Kemah, which was actually in Galveston County, to our south. Mutual aid was developed back in 1947 when Texas City blew up. The Grand Camp had caught fire and was allowed to pull into Texas City port so the fire could be extinguished. The official story was it blew up, causing the tank farms around it to catch fire and explode as well. The story I grew up with was the ship was filled with munitions en route to some French colony in South America, and the explosion was caused by weapons that were not supposed to have been on board. The 2-ton ship's anchor was flung 1.5 miles away. Since the entire fire department was near the ship when it blew, there was nobody left to fight the fires. All surrounding departments were called to help out. This eventually led to what is known as the mutual aid agreements that are pretty much standard throughout Texas. At our station, we had a secret about the Coke machine. Several buttons, instead of selling Coke, would dispense beer. You'd put in a quarter, push one of the first 3 buttons, and out would pop a can of beer. Being on school property, this was a violation of some policy, but who's going to tell? I didn't drink Coke or beer, but I thought this was kind of a neat idea. I've always drank a lot of coffee. Much better. Mac Knight was a well-known member of the department. He owned a city block on the north side of town. There was just one old house and a whole lot of things that should have been thrown away. He was just a bit of a hoarder. We discovered that he would go through the trash at night and take home anything that caught his eye. Things like flyers and advertisements from companies wanting to sell us some fire-related equipment. Any broken or worn-out gear wound up on his property somewhere. Mac would show up any time the alarm went off. He'd make coffee and keep an eye on everybody's things. We tended to show up and drop everything not wanted at a fire on the floor around where our gear hung. Wallets, keys, all kinds of things. And nobody ever messed with anything, but he still felt it was his job to keep an eye on everything. Mac didn't have a family, so in his will, everything he owned was left to the fire station. That enormous city block of old broken firefighting equipment and boat motors and you name it, it was all going to the fire station when he passed on. Being a bunch of Type A personalities, we did some odd things. In every fire engine was a fishing tackle box. In this box were different kinds of cigarettes and lighters. You didn't want a lighter in the pocket going into a fire. Guys would come out coughing up black mucus, open the box, and light up. We called it replacing the bad smoke with good smoke. Now, this is probably why so many firefighters died from heart attack. I tend to forget some folks don't run in the same groups as me. Here are a few things you should know about firefighting things. An engine is built to pump water. A pumper is called a fire engine or simply an engine. A truck has a lot of ladders on it, and it's called a fire truck or just a truck. Truckies are sent in to beat up the house so the fire will go out. They chop holes in roofs and open holes in walls. I don't want to go in the whole fire triangle and how fire works. There are poisonous gases that can also burst into flames that have to be removed from a burning building. That's why holes get chopped in roofs. Hose heads spray water on everything. I was a hose head, and I do mean we sprayed water on everything, even things that weren't on fire. You're in a room where it's pitch black and you can't see anything. You know it's hot, you know there's fire somewhere, so you just blast away and hope that you're hitting what you need to. A squad is a rescue vehicle. A bunker gear is yellow coat and pants made from fire retardant materials. When I first joined, it was all black and it was heavy cotton. Really good to see on a dark street at night. A bunker gear or turnout gear is the term used by fire departments to refer to protective clothing worn by firefighters. The name bunker gear was derived from the fact that the pants and boots were traditionally kept by a firefighter's bunk at night in the fire station so they'd be ready for use. My cats are going nuts. Holy cow. On the tailboard was a buzzer. 1 buzz let the driver know to stop. 2 meant go ahead, and 3 was to back up. It's the exact same signals used by a train. Sometimes the driver would get in a hurry and he wouldn't listen for the buzzer. Fire engines don't accelerate all that well. Lots of weight. They also don't stop very fast. One night, I was about to jump on the tailboard when the vehicle started to move. I'd done this before. You just have to jump a bit farther and land on the tailboard. Just as I jumped, the guy on the tailboard hit the buzzer and the driver stopped. Well, I jumped and slammed into the back of the fire engine. I bounced off the back and fell onto the floor, landing square on my backside. Well, now my front and my back both hurt. I managed to pull myself up onto the tailboard. All the way to the fire, I was questioning the intelligence of what I was doing for fun. There's a lot of training necessary to be a firefighter. You did most in-house, getting together on a Monday night. Once in a while, someone would have an old house they wanted torn down. They would allow us to set it on fire and then put it out, then set it on fire again and put it out again. Once the building was mostly destroyed, it would be torn down and hauled away to the dump. Anytime we had one of these burn houses, all the mutual aid stations would come over and they would train with us as well. We might have 4 or 5 different departments all together at one spot. The big thing everybody wanted to do was to go to the A&M fire training. Once a year, some of the lucky guys got sent to Bryant Fire Training Field. It's Brayton Fire Training Field at College Station. You had to show the folks at the station that you were going to be around for a while. They didn't want to spend the money on folks that would join and then quit the next week. We had a lot of those. Folks would think, oh, I'm going to be a firefighter, and they'd walk in and fill out the paperwork, and then usually that first really bad fire, we wouldn't see them again after that. So the fire department would send people that they thought were going to be around for a while, and they'd have to pay for the hotel room and the food and the gas and the admission price to get into the school. The first time I went was December 1981. We got up early to take the bus out to the field. It was somewhere well below freezing. Bunker gear is warm until it gets wet. The instructors would start a fire and we'd go in to do what we were supposed to do. The water was going in all directions. Once the fire was out, we walked back outside and proceeded to freeze. I literally had ice on my gear. The only way to get warm was to walk into the next burning structure. And then the ice would melt, we'd put the fire out, and it would freeze again. This went on for 8 hours. I think I learned something. I can't really remember what. I do remember it was cold just about all day. Once we got back to Seabrook, we had to teach what we had just learned to the rest of the station. I guess I did okay because in March the following year I was sent back for more training. The longer I was in the department, the more training opportunities came up. I did the Hearst Rescue Tool training, better known as the Jaws of Life. Tear a car apart bit by bit is essential to save someone trapped inside. It's also very dangerous. We had an old set of jaws. They were heavy and hard to work with. Both handles were across from each other. There were two levers you had to push with your thumbs. To hold the tool up, you had to balance it on one knee. Both wrists got a real good workout trying to maneuver this thing because all the weight was out in front of you. After using this device to save a few dozen folks, we asked our chief if we could maybe buy a new tool. He said he'd call the company and ask how much it would cost to replace just the jaws. He contacted the Hearst company and told them what we were looking to do. Did they have any kind of a trade-in for the old stuff? The rep asked what the serial number was on our unit. When the chief told him, there was a long pause. A very long pause. The rep asked if the serial number was correct. The chief read it to him again. The rep said he was going to be at our station the next week with some offers for us. The guy showed up with a 42-inch spreader, a 32-inch spreader, a set of hydraulic rams, a cutting tool, two brand new power plants. He said we could have everything in exchange for that old spreader. It turned out our Hearst tool was one of the first ones ever built. It was also made out of titanium. The company didn't have any of the original tools to show in their museum, and they wanted ours. We got the entire set of rescue tools in exchange for one old beat-up spreader. During one rescue, we had a young woman pinned under the steering wheel. We pulled the door off its hinges to get to the wheel, and I had to reach under the dash to get her feet free from the pedals, so I pulled my helmet off to be able to work. A hand reached down and began massaging the side of my face. I thought one of the female paramedics was fooling around. Not a bad thing, but I went and I looked up, and it seemed everybody was really busy trying to keep the patient alive. I ducked back down under the dash, and there was that hand again. It was fiddling with my ear and then stroking my cheek. I grabbed the hand so I could see who it belonged to. The patient, who was very much unconscious, was running her hand through my hair. It was just one of those things you never expect to have happen at an accident. One night I was sitting at home when I got a feeling something was going to happen. It was weird how the longer I was a firefighter, these weird feelings would pop up out of nowhere. There was nothing on TV, and I decided I'd just drive over to the station. I got there and I noticed the lights were on. Inside, I discovered two other firefighters were already there. They both said they had a feeling something was going to happen. Shortly after I arrived, two more firefighters came in, and they kind of had the same story. We sat around talking about how weird it felt when the alarm went off. There was a car fire on Toddville Road. A car fire wasn't really anything to get excited about. We rolled Unit 104 out the door and were en route within seconds. 104 was the rescue truck, all the things needed at a vehicle accident and just enough water to put out a vehicle. We were a block from the car fire when we discovered the car was inside a garage attached to a house. The car fire was actually a house fire. We called for a second alarm. After the fire, the other firefighters wanted to know how we got rolling so quick. We told them we'd had a feeling something was going to happen. This was not the only time something like this happened. On another occasion, we were at a house fire. We had our SCBAs on, and we were about to go in, but we both stopped. Something didn't feel right. We looked at each other and both felt like we shouldn't enter this building. A few seconds later, the roof fell in, landing right where we would have been had we gone in. One day, the chief announced there were some females that had decided they wanted to join our happy little family. Some of us, and I must admit I was one of them, I didn't much care for this idea, but, well, we had to move on with progress. The problem I had with allowing women to join was they tended to be somewhat weaker than the guys. The women who all joined that week were kind of small, running about 5'2" maybe. If you can't change your mind, you're not growing. One of the new recruits was named Karen. Yes, that was her name. She was named Karen, but she really wasn't a Karen. She was a worker. It turned out she also had a few degrees in various things. Chemistry. To make things just a little bit stranger, she was from Australia. She dressed and talked just like Steve Irwin, but she was built a little bit more like Dolly Parton. She worked at one of the chemical plants, and she lived in our town and decided she wanted to be a firefighter. I kind of thought she was all body and no brains until I found out that she had so many degrees, and she was a worker, like I'd said. We had a restaurant fire one night, and I sent her to the engine to get an axe. The fire was inside the wall, behind the fryer. The wall was made out of old shiplap. If you've ever hit shiplap with an axe, you'll know it's hard, especially the older wood. Karen came back with the axe, and I held out my hand for it. She pushed me to the side and went to work on that wall. She put an 8 by 6 foot hole in the wall in record time. I definitely had to change my idea about females in the fire department. One day we had an alarm at 2 p.m. I jumped on the engine and we rolled to the scene. Black smoke was billowing from a kitchen window. I grabbed an air pack and the hose and went to work. There was a young guy waving his arms in the air, yelling and screaming as I walked towards the building. He had on blue jeans and nothing else. I walked by him, kind of ignoring him, and entered the kitchen. The stove was ablaze and it had spread to the cabinets. The room was filled with thick black smoke, and I was on my knees close to the floor where it's a little cooler. We put the wet stuff on the red stuff. You have to open all the cabinets and pull things out so you can get to all the fire. The flames had also gotten into the living room. As I was looking for more flames, my bell went off, letting me know that my air tank was just about empty. When you had 5 minutes of air left, the bell would ding, and that was time to get the heck out. If you were more than 5 minutes away from the exit, you were going to be in trouble. I walked out to the engine past the young guy who's still yelling and waving his arms. I got a fresh SCBA, and I went back in once more, passing the guy who was still yelling and screaming and waving his arms. I wished I had that kind of energy. We mopped up the kitchen and the living room, and we began clearing the smoke. We needed some fans, so I walked out to the engine to get an exhaust fan. The young guy is still yelling and waving his arms around. That's when I noticed he had a huge butcher knife in one hand. He was swinging this knife at me every time I'd walked by him. He was panicking about having set his house on fire, and he wanted me to work harder putting it out. I called the police over and pointed out the knife, and they got it away from him and managed to settle him down finally. I was so focused on the fire I ignored what might have been a serious problem had he stuck that knife in me somewhere. It was huge and very sharp. I lived on NASA Road 1, right down from Johnson Space Center. Really, I was just a couple of miles from the place. One night I was taking the garbage out to the dumpster. I was walking back to my apartment when I heard squealing tires and a horn, followed by a thud, which was followed by a second thud, and then lots of screaming. I grabbed my two-way radio and called dispatch, telling them there was a vehicle pedestrian accident. I gave them my address, and then I pulled my pickup out into the street. At the time, I had a light bar on the roof, as well as a siren under the hood. I put the lights on, and I went over to look at the victim. Laying in the middle of the street was what I thought was a young boy, with some really bad injuries. There was blood everywhere. The right leg was bent where it shouldn't be, and the foot was up under the armpit. The first thing I did was I stabilized the head and neck. When I grabbed the head, it felt like the skull moved under my fingers. Well, this is not a good thing. A second paramedic came and began patient assessment. She cut all the clothes off, and we realized that this was actually a young woman. She had very short hair. There were tire marks going across her abdomen. Also not a good sign. I discovered I was kneeling on teeth, most of them, and she'd also bit her tongue off. She had several broken ribs. Her left arm was dislocated. We both figured she wasn't going to live much longer. The puddle of blood was about 6 feet across. A car stopped and a man jumped out, announcing he was a doctor. Anytime you have a doctor at a major accident, it's always either a psychologist or somebody that's good at math. No, this guy actually worked in the ER. The crowd was being their usual unwelcome selves. People were getting in our way, trying to tell us what to do. Everyone was too busy trying to save the patient, so we didn't have any crowd control. The police were all busy at another accident. I saw several people all clustered together with looks of grief and concern. I called one of them over and I asked if they knew the patient. Turns out they were her family. I pointed to the crowd and I asked if they could maybe get them to move back. They did too. Pushing and yelling and hitting people, screaming. The family got the rubberneckers well away from us so we could do our jobs. Anybody that attempted to come any closer to us than they thought was necessary would get punched right in the chest or shoved, or it was kind of violent. They did a really good job, though. I used to always tell people at the fire station that we should have somebody that would walk around crowds at accidents and fires and charge admission. $5 if you wanted to watch, and it was $20 if you wanted to give advice. Well, we never did do that. We got the patient on a backboard, but we figured she wasn't going to make it to the hospital. Once at the hospital, they figured she'd probably never make it through surgery. Once she got out of surgery, they figured she'd never walk again. She probably was going to have brain damage because her skull was cracked. as she got out of the hospital 3 months later, as she was in very good shape for having been hit by not one car, but two. The first car hit her. She was launched up into the air, landed on her head. That's when her tongue got bit off. She landed on the ground, and the second vehicle ran right across her abdomen, which was when her right femur got fractured. All of her teeth were replaced with ceramic implants, and they sewed her tongue back on. And she also suddenly had a very large chest area. Both vehicles that had hit her wound up paying for everything, and I guess she figured as long as she was in the hospital, she might as well have a little cosmetic surgery done. I found out later she was my neighbor. I didn't recognize her, what with all the blood and the broken parts everywhere. She'd been drinking just a little bit and decided to run across the street without looking in either direction. She didn't even know she'd been hit. You might say self-anesthetized. I didn't much care for driving. If you drove, you were also the guy working the pumps. Just about every fire was on the passenger side of the vehicle, so you didn't even get to watch what was going on. One night a call came in. There was a house fire on Mayor Road. I got stuck as the driver, and I waited for the buzzer to let me know the crew was on and ready. I pulled out the door, I turned left once more, and I saw flames. We were at least 6 blocks away from the fire, and I could see the flames above the treetops. I called dispatch and I said, "Give me another alarm." The closer to the house we got, the worse it looked. We hit the hydrant, and I stopped across the street from the fire. Flames were shooting up into the sky about 30 or 40 feet from a 1-story building. It was so hot I had to put my gloves on to work the pumps. The assistant chief went to walk the perimeter. He tripped over a copper cable that was about a foot above the ground. He tripped over a second, and then a third. It turned out there were ground cables every 3 feet all around a wood-framed house. The fire was hot, but it burned out fast. During the mop-up, we found coils of wire every 3 feet along all the outside walls. In what was left of the living room, we found several huge oxygen bottles. The owner was questioned as to what might have started the fire. It turned out he worked at NASA. He was one of the upper management boys at that. He had a huge magnetic field built into his house using coiled wire all along the perimeter. He liked being inside a magnetic field, so the voices from outer space didn't bother him while he was at home. As for those oxygen bottles, he would fill his house with O2 any time he was home. I guess he forgot about what happened to Apollo 1. Everything about this guy's house was weird, but there was nothing illegal. At the time, there was nothing that said you couldn't have a highly explosive and dangerous gas inside your house. In fact, I don't even know if today there's such a law. Oxygen is not flammable, despite what you might think. It promotes flame. So you spray oxygen onto something, it will simply burn better. But if all you've got is oxygen, it won't burn. On another night, I was stuck manning the engine at a hydrant. The fire was in an apartment on the lake, and the water had to be boosted a long way. I was standing at the pump panel with nothing to do but watch the gauges to be sure the water pressure stayed up. As I'm standing there in the middle of nowhere, a little kid walked up and handed me a cup of coffee. It was a very fancy cup, one of those with scrolled handle, the kind of thing you'd expect to see at a tea party. But it was filled with black coffee, just the way I liked it. I thanked him and I stood there drinking coffee and watching the gauges. Had to be careful holding that delicate little handle between finger and thumb. Once the coffee was consumed, I carefully set the cup on the running board. After a few minutes, the boy came back and I handed him the cup and I thanked him profusely. It wasn't until he was gone I began to wonder, where did he come from? I was in an intersection with nothing but closed businesses around me. I distinctly remember him coming from the far side of the engine, so he didn't come from the apartments. I've looked at maps of that intersection. There are no houses anywhere near where I was standing that night. The kid had never said a word, just handed me the coffee and then collected the cup a while later. It was the middle of the night, and the light above the pump panel made it hard for me to see any details. All I'm sure of is he was about an 8 to 10-year-old boy and came out of nowhere. On a mutual aid alarm, we went to Shore Acres on a boat shed fire. We arrived about the same time the LaPorte Fire Department showed up. There was some confusion as to whose jurisdiction the fire was in. The LaPorte chief told the Shore Acres chief he could take his fire engine and go. The Shore Acres chief told the LaPorte chief where to go. One of them, I don't remember which one, turned his back to walk away, and the other chief whacked him upside the head with his helmet. The two men got into a wrestling match, rolling on the ground, pretty much trying to kill each other. It's always fun to watch two guys fight that don't know how to fight. Lots of thrashing and rolling and swearing and not a whole lot of actual fighting going on. The 3 fire departments, those of us that actually worked for a living, we pulled the hoses down and we put the shed out, along with the boats inside. We figured let the brass figure out who was in charge. We knew what to do and how to do it. We put the fire out, and then we mopped up, we rolled up the hoses, all while these two were swearing and threatening each other. They were both going to sue. It turned out the fire was actually in Shore Acres. LaPorte really had no say in the matter. When everything was said and done, nobody got sued. Emotions run high at fires, and fist fights were not that uncommon. I don't know what it's like today, what with all of the politically correct mamby-pamby nonsense that everybody's having to live with, but back then it was a different world. You could literally punch somebody out and then later simply have to apologize and nothing came of it. July 1985, I attended a 6-day course at A&M Fire School. This was the chemical plant training. Seabrook sits between Texas City and LaPorte. Lots of chemicals and gas pipes running under the ground. If you lived in the area, hearing about a fire at one of the plants was normal day-to-day event. Only if something big blew up or somebody died did it become news. We used lots of foam that day or those 6 days in training to put out fires in mock-up loading docks and derailed trains. Oil and gas will float, so pumping water on them won't put the fire out. A foam is light enough that it will float on the surface of the water, but the gas and the oil will be underneath, and that's what puts the fire out. That's why when there's a chemical fire, you see a lot of foam. Looks like a overdone bathtub. The class I was in was made up of about 30 firefighters from all over Texas. During one bizarre maneuver, we had to control a fire on a multi-level platform. The floors were made of expanded metal. If you're standing on the very top of the building, you could look down all the way to the ground. My team was sent to the very top level. All 4 crews had to advance at the same time to push the fire back until the control valves could be turned off. The roar of gas coming from several open pipes was so loud that nobody could hear. We had to use hand and arm signals. The guy in charge waved everybody forward. We advanced, pushing the flames forward with the water. The crews below us did the exact same thing at the exact same time. As we got to the far end of the platform, the crews below us, all 3, lost water pressure. They all literally hot-footed it back to the staging point. We didn't get the memo. We were all the way on the top floor. Flames came up through the floor at our feet. It came up about knee-high, but still it was hot and kind of dangerous. Like being on an open flame grill, we were the hot dogs. The guy in charge of our team got us moving backwards while at the same time spraying water down at our feet to keep our boots from catching on fire. In the 1980s, an average of 130 firefighters died. Half were in training. In 1988, I was sent to Laredo as a brand new Border Patrol agent. They drove us out to Fort McIntosh for our introduction to the patrol. I saw a guy sitting across from me, and he looked familiar. He said I looked familiar as well. Bruce Carter had been a firefighter at one time, and so we sat there and we compared notes to see where we might have run into each other. He was from the Valley and I was from the Houston area. All the different fires we'd been to and all the different places we'd been, we couldn't quite come up where it was we'd run into each other. During one weekend, he went home. When he got back, he told me he was in the same class at A&M as I was in 1985. He'd actually had his mustache burned off during one of the many dangerous trainings we did. He had the class photo on the wall back home. I was sitting on the opposite side of the class from him. I have the same photo here in my office somewhere, but I'll be darned if I can find it. My office definitely needs a cleaning. I liked being a firefighter a lot. I still have several helmets hanging from my coat rack. My wife bought me a huge model fire truck. It sits on my bookshelf right next to my desk. One day I thought maybe I should try joining a paid department, like maybe the Great White Fire Truck to the north. I don't know who came up with that saying. Bob and Doug McKenzie are a pair of fictional Canadian brothers who hosted a TV show called The Great White North. A sketch was on SCTV for the show's 3rd season when they moved to CBC television in 1980. They made one movie called Strange Brew. Well, somebody began referring to the Houston Fire Department as the Great White Fire Truck to the north. Back then, you had to drive to the headquarters to fill out an application. The headquarters were in the Hogg Building. Just to our east is Jim Hogg County. There was a painting of the woman who the building was named after. Some folks are just mean. If your last name is Hogg, is it a good idea to name your daughter Ima? Yep, her name was Ima Hogg. She was born July 10th, 1882, and she was known as the First Lady of Texas. She was an American Society leader, philanthropist, patron, and collector of the arts, and one of the most respected women in Texas during the 20th century. She died in 1975, and she was named I'm a Hog. I drove into the big city and I filled out an application. Lots of questions about who I was and why I wanted to join the fire department. Once I was done, I had to wait for a reply. It had to come by mail. It took a couple of weeks before I was told to show up for a physical exam. I was told to go to the training center where I was going to be put through some tests. We had to drag a hose full of water. We had to pick up a dummy and carry it around, climb ladders and descend ladders, and we had to run back and forth, jump up and down, things to see that our bodies worked correctly. Of the 30 people or so, there were only 2 of us that were told to report for background checks. This entire process took about 6 months. By the end of the background checks, there weren't enough people left hardly to fill a class. Then there was some kind of a hiring freeze. I asked if once they started hiring, would I be picked up right away, and they said no, that I would have to start the whole process over again. Well, at the time, the Brooks Fire Department was hiring, so I went there instead. Fire trucks should not be green. It just looks wrong. Red is the proper color. White is okay, but green is the color of dump trucks, not fire trucks. The fire truck at the Brooks Fire Department was green. But at least I was now getting paid to fight fires. Our station backed onto Armand Bayou Nature Center. Armand Bayou is full of alligators. Some of them are huge. One was called Granddad. He was long enough to lay across the road and have his head on one curb and his tail up on the other. Folks would call the station and say there was an alligator in their yard. Well, there was nothing we could do about it. We'd tell them to keep their kids and their pets inside, and eventually the gator would go away. And people would get mad at us because we wouldn't go do the Steve Irwin thing to the alligators. I was a firefighter, not an alligator wrangler. We had some unusual folks living in the neighborhood. A lot of them worked at NASA. There was one house I was called to several times. It would always come in as a kitchen fire. We'd arrive on the scene, and I went in, and there was a stove in the kitchen, and it was on fire. Not liking the ceiling, but still, it was inside their house. I had grabbed a CO2 fire extinguisher, and the fire was out in no time. No other parts of the room were burned, just the stove. Well, it turns out that their stove was covered in grease, and I mean literally covered. The grease would get hot, burst into flames while the wife was cooking dinner. As soon as the fire was out, she went back to cooking. I suggested that maybe they should clean the stove before using it, but I was promptly ignored. The guy was a NASA engineer, and I was just a city employee. I tried to file a complaint with the community manager since this was a hazard, but I was told that I could easily be replaced. In other words, keep your mouth shut. It was a danger not just to the folks in the house, but the houses on either side. Well, I was told, don't make waves. This guy was a NASA engineer. Whoopee. I was not very good at keeping my mouth shut. I would get into a few discussions with the good folks living in the neighborhood. I got to talk to the community manager on several occasions where I was told that I could easily be replaced if I didn't behave. Well, I liked being a firefighter so much I stayed with the volunteers at the same time as I was getting paid for it. And like I said earlier, being a volunteer was so much more fun. There are a limited number of frequencies used for fire department communications. One day we began hearing people talking on our radios. These folks were not ours. They were talking about a plumbing job. This went on for several days. We all listened, trying to figure out who they were. One day, one of the plumbers mentioned a job location. The chief and the fire marshal went lights and sirens to the address. We didn't hear the plumbers on our radios again after that. The Montgomery County Fire Department was on the same channel as us. They were north of Houston, and the signal sometimes would get as far as us. This was caused by a skip in the atmosphere. I can't go into the whole thing about how radios work, but this is kind of why AM stations used to go off the air at night, so other stations didn't interfere with each other. One night at the Seabrook station, we heard the alarm go off, followed by dispatch saying there was an apartment fire on Lakeside Drive. We had a lakeside drive, and it was full of apartments. We jumped into our gear, but before we could get going, we heard Engine 101 was en route. We're standing on the tailboard of 105, looking at 101, which was still in the bay. It turned out Montgomery had a lakeside drive as well as an Engine 101. Depending on things in the atmosphere, signals can go a lot farther. If you have a repeater, your broadcast can really go a long ways. Having the ability to speak to hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, can have its advantages, and it can have career-ending problems. Everything being broadcast from a station or dispatch has to be logged in a book. Also, you have to do station identification on a regular basis. These are just some of the FCC rules. One day, as we're going about our usual tasks, we hear the repeater open up. We didn't have a repeater. Our area wasn't that big, so we knew that this was Montgomery County. The sound of somebody moving things around an office came over the air. It didn't take long to figure out the radio operator at Montgomery County had moved the logbook and accidentally keyed the mic. Naturally, some of us yelled at the speaker, "Move the logbook!" But of course, she couldn't hear us. And this kind of thing happened from time to time, and usually it was caught in a few seconds. Worst case, it might take a minute. We could hear the phone being dialed, followed by a one-sided conversation. The dispatcher was calling her girlfriend. She began talking about the date she'd had the night before. As she described her night out with Mr. Studd, the new paramedic. They went somewhere and had dinner, and then another place for some drinks, and then things got interesting. The dispatcher said they went back to her place, and things happened. Clothes were removed, and, well, she was very descriptive in telling about what they did together. It became an X-rated radio show. It was being sent out to everyone and anyone with a two-way radio within a 75-mile radius of Conroe, Texas. The firefighters and paramedics in Montgomery County were trying to call and tell her the mic was open, and she was entertaining folks with her personal life. She had the phone tied up talking to her friend, and since the radio was on tower, nobody could get through. Then she made things worse. She started comparing Mr. Studd to everybody else. Apparently, she had been out on dates and other things with a lot of firefighters and medics and a few cops to boot. She began naming names and what they had done on various times together. It was getting kind of seedy. It was like watching a train wreck. You couldn't look away, or in our case, stop listening. Someone up there got a brilliant idea and they called in on the emergency line. The phone rang and the dispatcher said, "Hang on a second, I have to answer this." "Montgomery County EMS, what is your emergency?" "It is? You can? Oh my!" The radio went dead. She must have moved the logbook at long last. It was quiet up north for some time, and finally an alarm came in and a male dispatcher gave the information out. We never heard that other dispatcher again after that day. If you have a two-way radio anywhere near you, make sure the mic isn't stuck before saying anything that might get you in trouble. One morning I was getting ready for work. I had my uniform on and I was walking out to my pickup when I heard a loud explosion. It came from the other side of Clear Lake, right about where Kima sat. I was opening the door to my truck when the alarm went off on my pager. Mutual aid in Kima for a ruptured gas line. I hit the gas and I went to Seabrook Station instead of going to work. Once there, we rolled across the river and we met with the Kima Fire Department. A backhoe was digging a ditch and he ruptured a 12-inch gas pipeline. The engine caused the gas cloud to explode, the engine of the backhoe. Fortunately, the guy running the backhoe had run as soon as he saw the pipe. Kima had their engine parked as far from the burning pipe as they could and still put water into the hole. The idea wasn't to put the fire out. It was to keep the 36-inch gas pipe next to the 12-inch gas pipe cool. The water was evaporating as soon as it hit the flames. The hole never filled with water. We didn't want that 32-inch pipe rupturing because that would have really made an explosion. We hooked our engine up to the hydrant and we boosted water to the engine working as a monitor, or a water cannon. One by one, we would take turns walking over to the engine close to the fire to man the pumps. We each did a 10-minute turn, waiting for the chemical plant to drain the gas pipe. It took 3 hours. By the time I got to work, the assistant chief was very much ready to go home, but we had an agreement from the very start that if something happened in Seabrook, where we both lived, and where we were both volunteers, we would take care of our hometown first. I was soaked with sweat and physically worn out, and I still had a 21-hour shift ahead of me. Firefighting is a dangerous job. I broke my left arm falling off a roof. I landed okay, but when I went to get up, I noticed my hand was sticking out about 3 inches closer to my elbow than it should have. I said, "That should probably hurt," and then it did. If you've never broken any bones, I highly recommend you don't do it. I also broke my right thumb at a fire at the police station, and I had to finish fighting the fire before getting it fixed. Half my hand turned black. I fell off another roof and I broke my ankle. I got in a fight at an accident. Yes, another fist fight broke out and I had 2 ribs caved in. When I threw my back out, I thought I was going to die. It hurt that much. The weird thing is I would get patched up and I'd go right back to being a firefighter. I hope you enjoyed this visit to the past. As I was writing up my notes, it was almost like I was back there in Seabrook fighting fires and having a grand old time. Anytime you see a group of firefighters, be they paid or volunteer, just keep in mind these guys are doing something that most people would never dream of doing. Most folks are running away when firefighters are running into the problem. Just look at how many folks die each year fighting fires, and about half of them are volunteers. If you enjoyed tonight's show, let your neighbors and friends and people you don't even know that there's a podcast out here that they should be listening to. If you want to contact me, you can get a hold of me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?